What's up guys, I'm BTC. I often get asked if the meta really matters for the lower bracket ranks. This usually happens when discussing hero balance or a new patch that just got added. Whenever I talk about hero balance, I always do my best to try to break it up into parts. I will explain that a certain change will have one effect on the upper bracket and pro players, and it will have a different effect on the lower bracket players. I try to do this for every change that I think will have some sort of different effect because the majority of players are not in the top 500 or the Overwatch League. It's important to understand the difference in playstyle and the value that certain characters and changes will have in both the high level of play and the lower bracket of the ladder. One of the examples I like to use for this is when Blizzard decided to buff Reaper's lifesteal during the high point of GOATS comp. In my video, I explained how it would affect the meta, and in this case that it wouldn't change anything, but I also made sure to mention that it would carry a lot of negative effects for the lower bracket players, and that it would cause problems, and I think a lot of you guys would agree that it certainly did cause some problems. Now, other Overwatch sources of information at the time chose to almost exclusively focus on the upper bracket and pro level of play. Not only did they come to the incredibly stupid conclusion that the Reaper buff would somehow end GOATS comp, demonstrating just how clueless they are about knowing how the game actually works, but they also had complete disregard for how those changes would affect the majority of the player base, the players in the lower bracket, which is both short-sighted and pretty insulting. So then, when we talk about the meta, it also needs to be broken into separate categories, just like a buff or a nerf would be on an individual hero, as it too can affect players differently. The thing that is commonly referred to as the meta really only applies to the ranks of Diamond and above. For the most part, the meta has very little impact on players who are Platinum and below. However, the lower bracket still does have a sort of meta on its own. It's not a true meta, as I will explain in a minute. It's more like a meta light or diet meta, however you want to look at it. So let's take a step back for a second. What exactly is the meta? The meta is a combination of specific characters using a defined strategy. There are 3 requirements to properly playing the meta. The first is that the players need to use the correct heroes of the meta. Sometimes there can be a small amount of variety. For example, in GOATS comp, there were a few variations in the healers. While Lucio and Brigitte were required, the third healer could be Moira, Zenyatta, or Ana, depending on what team was playing it and what they wanted to run. Likewise, Reinhardt could be swapped out for a Winston if they wanted more mobility or access to high ground. But the thing is, the core of the team comp was still there. It was still triple tank, triple support, and they still ran the strategy for that comp. However, if one of the players on the team decided that they just weren't going to play Zarya, and instead they wanted to play Soldier 76, then a large amount of the strength in that team comp just was lost. So the first thing for the meta is that everyone on the team needs to be willing to use the correct heroes. The second part of the meta is there needs to be a defined strategy. Simply picking the characters is not going to be good enough, specifically in the higher levels of play. There are strategies that need to be used. Think of it in a way similar to football and how both offense and defensive teams decide to run a different kind of play each time. Players need to understand the play that their team is running, and it needs to be done in the correct way. If one of the receivers starts running in the wrong direction, then it's going to mess up the entire play. The third part of the meta is that the players need to have enough communication, coordination, and individual skill in order to effectively run the strategy. Let's start by looking at the perspective of the upper bracket and pro players. Players in the higher ranks are much more likely to use characters that are in the meta because for the most part they prioritize winning over just playing whatever hero they want to use. And that's even more true for pro players who are actually getting paid to win the matches. They want to win. Personal preference kind of gets thrown out the window at that point. The second part of the meta is understanding the strategy. Pro players will spend a great deal of time learning and practicing those strategies over and over again, so there's no problem there. Upper bracket players are also going to be much more invested in the game and will likely have a good deal of knowledge on how things are supposed to go. There are exceptions, of course. I've run into more than a few GM players who are great at playing the game, but just simply do not understand the larger strategies involved. And then checking in with the third part, do the top 500 and pro players have enough coordination and skill to pull it off? Well, obviously, yes, they do, given the high rank and the fact that they're on pro teams, so that's not an issue. But now let's run through that checklist with the lower bracket players. This is bronze through platinum rank on the ladder. The first part is, are they able to play the characters in the meta? Well, yes, of course they can. It's as simple as clicking on the hero and pressing OK. However, in the lower bracket, players are much more likely to use heroes they think are fun, as opposed to what characters might give them an objectively better chance at winning. So while one or two people on a team may be willing to play the meta characters, it's unlikely the entire team will want to do that. For the second part, understanding the strategy, this is something that, again, other Overwatch sources are quite often pretty insulting about in regard to lower rank players. The usual insults that you will hear go something along the lines of, well, you're just such and such rank, and therefore you don't understand how the game works. Side note, I find it odd that some people would continue to read and view Overwatch sources that repeatedly insult them as a player. I mean, if they're gonna insult you, why are you supporting them, right? But regardless, the entire principle of that insulting argument is utter nonsense anyways. Having an understanding of how the game works, how the meta works, is an entirely separate skill from being able to physically play at a high level. Can a bronze player learn the strategy of the meta? Yes, absolutely. In the same way a football fan can learn the dozens and dozens of running and passing plays of their favorite team. Moreover, the vast majority of coaches in a wide variety of sports are completely unable to play the game themselves at a pro level, despite having an astounding level of knowledge of the game. The idea that you can't be a coach on a football team unless you can throw as well as the quarterback is just stupid. So yes, contrary to what the Overwatch elitists may think, any player of any rank can learn the strategy of the current meta, and the idea that a bronze player is incapable of understanding the meta is both wrong and insulting. Unfortunately, however, just like with the first part of this checklist, even if you are doing the right thing, it doesn't mean that the rest of your team is going to. So while you may be using the right characters and using the right strategy, if someone on your team is trying to Rambo flank with Genji, then you're gonna have a bad time. But then we arrive at the third item on this checklist, which is like hitting a brick wall. Even if you have the right characters, even if you understand the meta strategy, even if your team is working fully with you, you still need to have enough individual skill to pull it off. And to be perfectly blunt, a player that is in bronze or silver is simply not going to have the level of skill required to accomplish this. Characters like Zenyatta and Ana require a high level of accuracy. Other characters require very high situational awareness. This is just something that you need to work on. It takes a huge amount of practice. And if you're in bronze or silver or gold, chances are you don't have these skills. Now, I'm not saying this to be mean, it's just something that you need to be aware of and work on. Everyone has to start somewhere. Don't look at it like it's a bad thing like the Overwatch elitists would. Instead, treat it more like a challenge that you need to overcome. But hang on a second, you remember how I said there was a kind of meta light or diet meta for the lower bracket? Well, it's a very real thing, but it doesn't work the same way as the normal meta does. The diet meta, I'm just gonna call it that from now on, is almost exclusively based on hero picks. There is no defined strategy or skill requirement involved. In fairness, calling it a meta is kind of a loose way of referring to it, but essentially, the diet meta is based entirely on what characters are objectively the strongest without requiring a lot of team coordination. The diet meta moves even slower than the normal meta does. In fact, with Blizzard's recent decision to make frequent balance changes, the normal meta is probably going to shift around quite a bit, but the diet meta is still largely going to be unchanged. Let me give you an example. For a very long time, before the role queue system, Moira was considered to be the worst healer in the game for upper bracket, and had the lowest pick rate. However, at the same time, she was the #1 pick in Bronze through Platinum. How could this be? Why would a character that is so far out of the normal meta have such a high pick rate in the lower bracket? The answer is that Moira requires almost no team coordination whatsoever, but she can still be quite effective. Her healing is a large area effect in front of her, which allows Moira to heal quite a bit with very little effort. She also has one of the best escape abilities in the entire game, making her survivability pretty good, even if your other healers and tanks aren't really paying attention. Her ultimate isn't particularly powerful, but it has the ability to do both damage and healing at the same time in a pretty decently large area, while also ignoring barriers. It also has a pretty low ultimate cost, so the player can use it quite often. Other characters like Reinhardt, Mercy, Reaper, and Roadhog are in very similar situations. They require very little team coordination, but are still able to provide a pretty good amount of value. The old version of Brigitte would also fall into that category, but after the rework, that's changed. The new Brigitte requires significantly more teamwork in order to be effective because of the substantially reduced survivability. Her pick rate, as a result, in the upper bracket is kind of middle of the road, but in the lower bracket, it has plummeted pretty low. So to answer the question, does the meta matter in lower brackets? The answer is kinda yes, kinda no. It's not the same meta that you will see in the top 500 or the Overwatch League, and that is a very important distinction to make. There may be some character overlap if one hero is particularly powerful, like in the case of old Brigitte. But for the most part, the diet meta that you see in the lower bracket is almost entirely based on certain characters providing a large amount of value without the need for team coordination. And because of this, using those characters specifically in the lower bracket can absolutely give you an advantage, just like their counterparts would for the normal meta in the upper bracket. However, there is a slight exception to this. If you have, let's say, hundreds and hundreds of hours practicing on one particular hero, then chances are you, as an individual, have a better chance of winning if you stick to that character rather than trying to fulfill whatever role in the diet meta, right? Like, you don't need to use those other ones if you're already quite proficient at this one. Remember, the diet meta is more based on the strength of the character, and if you're really good with something, then you can keep using that. You don't have to worry about the other stuff. Another thing that you do want to consider, though, is that if you are using one of those diet meta characters in order to rank up, you may very well find yourself in a bad position upon reaching Diamond, where the real meta begins to take over. Then, the character that you've been specializing in may not be good enough for the upper bracket. Because of the way the diet meta works in the lower bracket, it means that smaller balance changes will have very little impact, and it will usually require substantial buffs, nerfs, reworks, or even a new hero to cause a shift in that lower bracket diet meta. It's been like that for quite a while, and it will probably continue to be like that for a very long time. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can get some cool gear, join my Discord server, or follow me on social media with the links down in the description below. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, and remember, always blame the controller, because it's never your fault.